Well, hello, and welcome back to Read Becca. It's time once again for my weekly chatty catch-up on everything I've read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading, as well as some general lifey chit-chat and catch-up. This week was a phenomenal reading week. This was like straight bangers. I don't know what happened, but the book that I have that's the lowest rated to talk about today was like a 4.25 probably, and so it was a great reading week, and I felt like I was just flying through stuff because I was enjoying it so much, probably. It was very good. Though I did finish Annie Bot this week, which I'm not going to talk about here because I already posted a vlog discussing that. So my previous video to this should be a vlog that included that. That was not as successful, spoiler for the vlog. But everything else that I read that I'm talking about today, great stuff. So let's start with my fun, entertaining read, because I kind of always have something really light on the go or something that's going to be very propulsive to read, more plot focused when I'm in the car or at the gym, that kind of stuff. So listening on audio. So I listened to 9 Goblins by Kingfisher. This is one of her older works that was, I believe, self-published and then just now got picked up for traditional publishing and has gained a resurgence, obviously. And I noticed it was on Hoopla when I was returning my previous book, and so I dove in. It's a short novella, and it's very humorous. We're following 9 goblins in a military squadron, basically. There's this ongoing goblin war that's just feels like it's an endless war. The goblins, the elves, the humans constantly come and meet on the hillside and fight all the time, and nothing ever changes. And then something happens after an encounter with a wizard. The goblins end up on a misadventure behind enemy lines. And that's the plot of it. It's a about 4-hour, I think, novella on audio, so not terribly long. It's very plot forward, but it brings the heart and charm and rich characters that I think any of us who have read Kingfisher know we can rely on, and a heavy, heavy dose of humor. But that doesn't mean it's without substance at all. I do think this was on the lower substance end of her work, but it's still prominently there. I think that she pulls in a lot of anthropology to this because she's giving us things about how goblin society works, especially at the beginning. You kind of get a lot about how and why things are happening to do with the goblins. We also, her other real interest is in nature and animals. And so we get a heavy dose of that. We get some strange plants. We have a veterinarian character who maybe I think for us is more like a wildlife rehabber. And that wildlife is sometimes standard wildlife, but sometimes somewhat magical and not typical. There is a major portion of this encountering a skeletal stag, which I think shows up in some of her other work as well. But that core of the characters being really relatable and empathetic, it being about understanding humans and how we interact with the world and difference, I think is a big element. The sense of humor many people have in primarily her short fiction compared T. Kingfisher to Terry Pratchett. Her humor is that vibe, maybe Douglas Adams. And this is the strongest, I think, of her work that I've read in terms of being humor forward, and also the very most Pratchett-esque, because it is commenting so much on society and how things work together, people who are different work together. And that core is just so great and fun as well. So this was short, it was fairly insubstantial, but it does really have a depth to it despite that lack of substance, if that makes any sense. The plot, I think, is insubstantial, but there's a lot there to draw out of it. So I just had such a fun time with this. This was great. I continue on my journey of wanting to read every single thing that T. Kingfisher has written. I think her humor stuff mostly comes in the form of either short stories under her T. Kingfisher name or under children's work, under her Ursula Vernon name. And I think of those, my favorite is Castle Hangnail, but this comes pretty close. So anyway, onward to my next audiobook. Was a great, not a suggestion directly, but something that Ben and Lauren from Young's and the Restless had talked about recently, and so I picked it up. I specifically had an eye out for it because I've been wanting to read more sort of spooky psychological books. And so I picked up Shutter Island by Dennis Lehane. And this was fantastic as well. I've seen the movie, so I knew what was going to happen. This is a psychological thriller story that follows a pair of marshals showing up at Shutter Island, a remote island that houses an asylum. And they show up there because of the fact that a woman patient has gone missing from a locked room. So how could this have happened? And it's all about them investigating this. We're very in one of the marshals' heads through this. And we also are uncovering the secrets of the island. There's a lot of potential insidiousness. And key to that is that this is taking place in the 1950s. So we're coming out of a period of war, and there's a lot of references to that, and that our main character came from the military and his background. So those layers and nuances were really great, but I think I was mainly in it for this sort of creepy Gothic story, because even though it's the 1950s, it still has a very strong Gothic vibe. We're at this creepy asylum on a remote island. And naturally, as soon as the story starts, they are facing a storm and stuck on the island. And that just creates such an atmosphere, and the atmosphere and claustrophobia is so central to this. But of course, those secrets are also very, very prominent to it. And I'm not going to go into that, though probably most people know what this is. And actually, despite having seen the movie and knowing the major reveals to look for, as we were going along, I kept second guessing myself and being like, what, am I right? Do I misremember? Is it actually that? Could it actually be that? And the way that it was delivered kept me guessing, even knowing the ending. It was just so compelling to read. So this was a twisty, turny, Gothic, really atmospheric and claustrophobic psychological thriller that was pretty unputdownable. I just kept wanting to read. There are certain things that didn't work 100% for me. Like, this was still very top-notch, but like personally, there's kind of a horror standard in writing that writers often will put things in that are clearly provocative, like word choices or things that are very, very emotional that often don't necessarily feel natural, but they're there to provoke the reader. And I feel like that was overused here. It's also kind of frustrating because basically everyone behaves in a way that just lacks self-control. Everyone behaves very, very reactively and to extremes, and I don't feel like there would be quite that pervasive, even though we're at an asylum and there's a lot of crazy people. Just no one has any sort of restraint. And I think that was maybe effective for what the author was doing, but I could have used a little more nuance. We also get a couple of moments that were we're moving between reality and dreams at times, and those were a little hard to get a handle on, but I think, again, probably intentional because they were dreams, but I was just like, okay, why are we having this here? So there were some very, very minor quibbles that I had with this, but just everything about the story was so immersive. I forgot to talk about something that really made me think in this book, and mainly because it's kind of a minor moment, and it's mostly just made me think about things that are related to us now rather than what this is trying to say. But the conversation that's going on in this moment is two people talking about sort of the underlying what's going on. And one of them is throwing out all of these ideas that he has for what's happening that are kind of unsubstantiated. And he's built up these ideas internally without anything to back them up, right? It's a very sort of conspiracy theory. But then the other begins presenting a litany of facts and showing evidence for what is real. And the conspiracy-minded one is just kind of discounting those. And so it comes down to the one presenting the facts just saying, well, okay, you're not going to accept anything I say, even with all of these facts, and you're just saying this is all fabricated. And that's so interesting, being in the 1950s, when fabricating all this stuff would have been so much harder. And looking at that from a lens of today, with AI around us everywhere, where those things can be fabricated very easily. Virtually anything can be fabricated in terms of information that we have access to. So it just really made me think, because effectively, the one presenting the facts is kind of coming down saying, well, no matter what I present, you're going to maintain your conspiracy-minded idea, and you're not going to accept any of these facts. So sort of what is the point of having the facts? And yeah, it just really hit me hard reading this, how timely and appropriate that was to be reading right now, even though this book was written years ago. Loved it. And I now need to go back and rewatch the movie and see the things that they changed, because I know they kind of simplified some things and they did make some significant changes, but man, oh man, this was just delivered so well. And next, another kind of short one. I think this counts as a novella. So I read Wide Sargasso Sea by Rhys. Another fantastic one. This was a 5-star for me, I think. Though I can see why maybe people wouldn't get along with this one, because it is very dreamlike and about the prose and about the characters. Not a lot is really happening. This is more or less Jane Eyre fan fiction. It's a take on one of these side characters from Jane Eyre, who appears very minimally, but has a significant impact. And I think I'm going to keep that vague by only referencing the characters here as a man and a woman who are married. So we have 3 parts in this book. Part 1 and part 3 are very short, and they follow the woman's perspective. Part 2 is the majority of this book and follows the man's perspective. We start with the woman's perspective as she's a child, and part 1 reminded me a little bit of Kindred, in fact. There's no actual story similarities, but it feels kind of similar because you as the reader are being dragged through, or you're flitting through her growing up, from childhood up to adulthood when she's newly married. And over that time, you're just sort of dropping in at moments as she's having all of these hardships and tragedies over and over and over. And then you switch to the man's perspective. We get a little bit more continuity with his perspective when he enters the perspective to get married to her. And he's coming in because he needs money and she has a large dowry. There are a lot of things about, because she is in the Caribbean and he's from England, there are different cultures and understandings of their roles in life and what she may want out of life. She also has had a really difficult upbringing that was most of that hardship earlier, that I think formed her in a way, and he can't understand that fully. So one of the primary things that shapes his narrative is that someone else tells him things about her that may or may not be substantiated. The book doesn't really confirm for us. But regardless, this outside person tells him something that's potentially rumors spoken about his new wife, and that sort of poisons him toward her. And so he becomes this very brooding, bitter man toward her. That's really interesting because we do sort of see this kernel of love or hope for love in what is sort of a financial marriage, and her being very idealistic early on and having lots of hopes for their life in the future that turns sour really, really quickly. And that I felt did feel really, really true to the story of Jane Eyre, because in Jane Eyre, we have the same character has a moment of confession of all of the things that have gone on in this marriage to come up to the point where we see him in Jane Eyre. And in that confession moment, he's much more charismatic, but he is smug and narcissistic and very self-absorbed. And he is charismatically and convincingly telling the story of, oh, well, all these bad things have happened to me, and man, I had to take these mistresses and have affairs because what other choice did I have, you know? And so he's telling us this litany of him being kind of awful, and yet just going, well, you should empathize with me because I did what I wanted, you know, in the bad situation that I had. And yet there's no empathy for his wife. So that was really interesting to come from inside his head and talk through him having been a relatively sort of understandable character to him being this just very, very self-serving character that's consistent with the character from Jane Eyre. So in the final part, they have made it back to England and we're in the woman's perspective. And she's recognizing that all of those hopes and ideals that she had aren't going to play out. And she literally doesn't recognize England as she's there. And we're kind of seeing the breakdown of the relationship a little bit, but in a very abstract way. So again, very, very short section, and it feels really fragmented. So it's hard to read into what does that mean in terms of the framing, connecting it back to Jane Eyre. But one of the things that I think I did pull out of this really significantly from having this story, and some of this story we do have, very little bits we have from Jane Eyre in that sort of confession moment where we kind of get the man's side of things and his telling us more or less what this other person has told him that are, potentially rumors about her. So through that, it's been fleshed out a little bit more, or significantly more, but it's still very fragmentary. So you have to kind of read between the lines. And in that reading between the lines, I actually found this woman to be very similar to Jane in having such a difficult upbringing. Jane Eyre, like notoriously, the whole beginning part, she has a real hard time of things. And there are so many similarities there of them being these outsiders that don't really have anyone who cares for them and don't have any familial support around them. People just kind of keep going away. They keep having these tragedies and illness constantly hitting them or people around them, things like that. And so I felt like Rhys very, very much mirrored Jane's story in The Woman Here. And that was really interesting because I hadn't seen that as much before, recognized how similar women they were, and that this man maybe is predating on women that are of this type, that have reasons to be vulnerable, rather than just them being available there. And so there was a lot for me to pull out of this, but dominantly, I think the main thing is that it is a beautiful story, but it is kind of prose and character focused, and you have to be coming into it for the emotions and less so the plot. But having read this right on the heels of Jane Eyre, I feel I'm so happy I was able to do that, to get it in, because I saw so much more connecting it right back to having just read Jane Eyre that really, really enriched reading this. So that was a wonderful read. I really enjoyed it. And I'm going to say that for all of these because my final book is a nonfiction, Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War by Joanne B. Freeman. And this was so good. This will be on my favorites of the year, I'm completely certain. I don't even know how to talk about this because I always tab these all up and then I go through and try to remind myself of all the tabs that I want to talk to, if I want to read any of them, and there's always too many virtually every time. But going back through this, I kept reading. I just didn't stop reading because I was enjoying being back to reading this so much, even though I read this in only a couple of days. But this is exactly what it sounds like. This is sort of pure history. And Joanne Freeman is a historian that I follow regularly. She posts on YouTube all the time. And I listened to the audio of this. I immersive read it, so I did both together at the same time. And it's on Hoopla. So if you have any interest at all in this, I highly recommend getting the audio from Hoopla if you can. She is this person who is a tiny woman. I think she's under 5 foot, but she has this ebullience to her where it's just an enthusiasm for history. You can hear reading through the pages, you can hear the laughter behind what she's saying, or in the pauses, though she doesn't actually break out laughter at any point, I don't think. You can hear that delight in the things she's talking about. And it's so wonderful. So this leapt off the pages because of that, because she has that sense in everything that she's talking about. And it was just like being in there. It's very cinematic. So what this is about, this is, Joanne talks about the fact that while there have been individuals throughout time in Congress who have been violent, but as individuals who have been unique or separate from the wider sentiment. But during this time period, so predominantly the mid 1800s, so like 1830 to 1860s or 70, there was a culture and an underlying system of violence within Congress, and why that was. And that's what she's interrogating here. But she's a serious academic. She currently teaches at Yale, and she really, really went to primary sources for this. And one of the most wonderful things I think she did is relying really heavily on letters and diaries. And specifically, there are some pictures throughout. But these are the diaries of B.B. French. I think it's Benjamin Brown French. But he was a clerk at first in Congress in the 1830s. And he spent decades around those people and within Congress in different roles and took copious diaries. And so she had access to those diaries and relies on them heavily. So it takes on a narrative quality to this time by telling us this story through the lens of French's eyes. And that makes it so much more compelling to read. Like, I'm quickly becoming thoroughly convinced that letters and diaries are the way to tell people history because it's so much more easy to connect with the story as a human being and make it a human story rather than dry history when you do that. So we're talking through this. She launches off. The first thing she talks about is Dickens' impressions, Charles Dickens, visiting Congress and looking around and being grossed out because everyone has been spitting tobacco spit on the floor. And that is just such a great hook into the story. And she's talking about him being sort of repulsed. She's using his own words at points. But she goes on to talk about how the attitude that infers for us, because there were hundreds of spittoons around the Congress floor, but chewers often missed their mark, in part because they could. Covering the carpets only made matters worse, because congressmen didn't think twice about dirtying the mats. Dickens was describing just what he saw. The tobacco-juiced rugs of the House and Senate are an apt metaphor for Congress in the decades before the Civil War. Yes, there was a soaring oratory on occasion. Yes, there were union-shaking decisions being made, but underneath the speechifying, pontificating, and politicking was a spit-spattered rug. The antebellum Congress had its admirable moments, but it wasn't an assembly of demigods. It was a human institution with its very human failings. And that frames this so well, because so much of this, she's tackling individual and disparate instances at times, but creating the story of what that culture was. So we're talking about everything from, you probably have heard of the caning of Charles Sumner, a very, very famous event, all the way down to the fact that there were many less famous events of not just canings on the floor, but also duels, loads and loads of duels, and loads and loads of street fights, lots of posturing between them. And largely that comes down to the South having this sense of honor that is held within them, that violence and resorting to violence is required to uphold your honor, while the North are viewed as sort of weaklings by the South because they refuse. So you wind up in this separate reality to do with manhood and honor, where the North is viewing the South as dishonorable because they resort to violence, and the South is viewing the North as dishonorable because they won't resort to violence. And it recalled me back to reading Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, fantastic narrative nonfiction that I read for BookTube Prize, I think last year or the year before. And in that, it talked a lot about there being realities that are completely separate. And that really comes through here so much, because we really do have these people who can't connect their worlds. And there's a moment where Southerners are really decrying the fact that, well, why the heck do the North have all the good things, because they don't have the honor that we do? And it's like, you're so close to getting it, guys. Your values are really screwed up. You know, they're decrying that they're weaklings and they're dishonorable, but meanwhile, they don't recognize the sense of values is very different. And so much of that we can see today, though this doesn't draw any connections there. It predominantly is pure history focused on the time and reporting the history of the time. But there's such an interesting correlation, and that this was published in 2018, because there were these major revolutions in technology and industry and reporting that were going on. And she does such a good job of talking through that and how that affected everything that was happening in the world, and particularly really innovative stuff in news and the conflict between the establishment, Washington news, and independent journalism rising up against that. The ways that just nonsense was being published because they had access to print more than one edition per day. So they were just publishing crap and not bothering to verify it. The ways that the independent news was coming up against that and trying to do things differently and do things better. The ways that things like the Telegraph were speeding up communication in ways that they hadn't foreseen, so that people could sort of fact check in ways they hadn't before, where they were very reliant on letters from people who were there to get information before. They suddenly were able to get a broader source of information. But this is so interesting to get that picture of what a past Congress looked like during a period of extreme conflict. And there is this discussion of the news and how they were talking about it. The other side was plotting illicit plots with wild abandon. The other side was forcing its way to power with underhanded assaults. The other side was putting sectional interests above the good of the whole. The other side wanted to commandeer the Union. The other side was violating fundamental rights. And so they both had these, again, disparate realities that don't overlap at all. And so there's no sort of unifying element. And that really stoked this violence. And I love that she took so much time. It seems obvious, but she took a lot of time discussing the sense of honor and manhood and the ways that that was important to these people, but not just that it was an individual thing, that it was such a big deal because they were an extension of their people, of their constituents. And I think I personally have a strong understanding of that. And I personally do really view current Congress, current presidents, current representatives in general as a representation of me, as acting in my place. But I think that's uncommon. I don't think today we have that sense where she talks through at length how the people would hold them accountable for not being violent and dueling over their honor because the people saw them as an extension, and they would be really upset and think that they hadn't been well represented if their congressional representative was not out there fighting over their honor. And they would be out of a job, basically, if they didn't do that. So many people, even if they didn't want to fight, the people, constituents who they were beholden to, would push them to, particularly Southerners, obviously. So while I can look back on that and think, yes, this was obviously bullying and barbaric and Neanderthal, and we have come so far, we're still living with very similar things and a similar disparity today that we haven't really addressed or cohered between sort of sides in a way that is still echoing now, where those underlying values have, again, created polarization. And so I found so much to get out of this, and I feel like I could keep talking about this for a long time, but I just found so much joy in reading this, despite it being very violent and really a hard time in my country's history to read about. It just brought the history to life. I think if you are someone who has watched Death by Lightning, Netflix did a recent adaptation of Candace Millard's book. So if you like that kind of history, or if you enjoyed that show, really highly recommend this because it brings it to life off the page. It's so cinematic and so fun to read, and Joanne just is a delight. Yeah, I love her, and she will be coming back later in this video, I think. So with that's everything I read, and as usual, I have gone on too long. But everything I'm reading right now, I'm working on Obelisk Gate, a sequel, and I'm working on Galaxy and the Ground Within, a sequel. So my sequels, spring into sequels is going well. So those are the books. As far as what I watched, and I don't have a ton to say about what I watched, thankfully, I finished up watching The Girl from Plainville, and this is sort of, I think it's somewhat fictionalized, but it's primarily telling the real story of a girl who went on trial because she sort of encouraged her boyfriend, who was very depressed, to take his own life. And so that legal case is really interesting, but they do cover that, obviously, but they don't focus on that. They focus on the lead up and what was going on in his life and their relationship, and that there were some really big questions about their relationship because basically nobody knew that they were together until after he died. And I think they did a really good job of sort of telling that story and showing it not quite entirely as black and white. I came out with a little bit more sympathy for her than I had thought. But they do not pull punches on that in terms of being very upfront with some of the kind of more insidious things that were going on there. So I think it was really interesting, and I was just sort of wanting to dive into something like that was maybe true crimey or very compelling legal story. So yeah, that was just hitting the spot for me. Other than that, I don't think I finished any. Oh, I did finish Next Level Chef, because that's been going week to week, and the finale came out this week. So Next Level Chef is a Gordon Ramsay typical cooking competition, but this one is 3 levels of a building sort of thing, and the basement kitchen has the worst stuff all the way up to the top floor has really best high-end stuff, right? And they are all competing, and as they're competing, they each week get assigned to a different kitchen based on how they performed previously, right? So the idea being, if you're really the best, you'll be able to do top-notch regardless of which kitchen you're in, which may or may not be true, but regardless, they finished that up, and I enjoy that show every year. I think this is the 5th season. And with that, I think we are down to my week. My week ended up being much quieter than I had expected because I twisted my ankle walking dogs. It was a week when a lot of people were out. I think some people had either like a lot going on because of graduations and that kind of stuff. The holiday weekend this weekend is a 3-day weekend in the US for Memorial Day. And so we were very short on people. So I ended up walking dogs for like 7-8 hours this week. One day I was going in for 1 hour, and I ended up being there the whole rest of the afternoon because there were just so few people. So we were really short, and then I twisted my ankle and haven't been able to do anything. So that was really a bummer. And of course, it was the same ankle that I have been having a bad time with because I got a cat attack from one of my fosters previously, and I got a spider bite that then just completely inflated my foot. So it just has not, it's been like the world is against that particular leg that for some reason just needs to be left alone. So I ended up having to spend a lot of time. It still is like swelling up by the end of the day after I've been kind of on it. It's not in pain, so that's good, but in the morning it's completely fine, but by evening it's sort of swollen up every day. So I'm trying to keep it rested and lifted a lot, but I'm not very good at that. So that was my week for the most part. I can't think of anything else terribly noteworthy to mention. My foster cat did end up staying. She has been through everything that we needed to keep her quarantined here for. So I've started introducing her to my cat. We've got her transitioning over to a different food that they have more accessible at the shelter because she had digestive issues, and it turned out everything was just like she's stressed and doesn't like to change pretty much, which is very, very typical with cats. That's quite often what we end up finding when they come stay with me. So anyway, she's still around. So Yelly Cat is here, but she's napping right now. And I think that's all. So for my recommendations this week, I mentioned Joanne was going to be coming back. So Dr. Joanne Freeman did a talk at Trinity Chapel, which is a historic chapel in the New England area that has ties to the founders, and really, really it was a specific chapel within Trinity Church, within the wider Trinity Church. So Trinity Church. Anyway, so she did a talk about Hamilton, which is her specialty. So despite this book being about the Civil War era, she in fact is probably like the foremost scholar on Hamilton, and consulted with Lin-Manuel Miranda and everything. Like she is the go-to because she literally has been obsessed with Hamilton since she was a teenager 50 years ago. And she mentions that in the talk. And it was just a wonderful delight to listen to, such a great talk, and did a lengthy question and answer section at the end that was also super informative. It always amazes me, like, they're an expert in their field and everything, but still, it's so wild to see someone who can just answer questions that are really specific and detailed off the cuff and give a coherent, knowledgeable answer. And she's so good at that. So her specialty is the founding era, and Hamilton specifically within that, but she broadly covers American history for the most part. So it was a joy to hear her talk about her area of specialization. So I'm going to recommend that and link that down below for this week. So I think that is the end of my ramblings for this week. I hope you have a wonderful week in reading and in life, and thank you so very much for watching.